It was a warm, sunny afternoon near Buckingham Palace, and the streets were buzzing with tourists. Families posed for pictures, children waved little Union Jack flags, and street performers entertained the crowds. In the middle of it all, a royal guard stood tall and motionless. His name was Michael Andrews. Clad in the iconic red uniform and black bearskin hat, Michael was a picture of discipline and calm. Michael took pride in his job, even though it wasn't always easy. Tourists often tried to make him laugh or move, but he never gave in. Today, however, there was an unusual tension in the air. Michael noticed a man standing at the edge of the crowd, holding the leash of a large, muscular dog. The man, Richard, wore a smirk that didn't sit well with Michael. Something about his presence felt unsettling, but Michael remained focused, standing firm as ever. Richard wasn't like the cheerful tourists snapping photos or admiring the royal guard. His posture was tense, and he seemed to be observing Michael with an unusual intensity. He whispered something to the dog, and the animal growled softly, its body tensing as if waiting for a command. Michael's instincts told him to stay alert, but he didn't show any reaction. He had been trained for moments like this. The crowd, unaware of the brewing storm, continued to enjoy the afternoon. Children pointed at the guard, giggling as they tried to get his attention. But Michael didn't flinch. He was determined to do his job with dignity, no matter what distractions came his way. As the minutes passed, Richard began to move closer. His dog tugged at the leash, its growls growing louder. A few people nearby noticed and started to step back cautiously. Richard, however, seemed to enjoy the unease he was causing. "Look at him," Richard muttered under his breath, though loud enough for Michael to hear, standing there like he owns the place. Michael didn't react, but inside he was preparing himself. He had dealt with rude people before, but there was something different about Richard. The way he spoke, the way he held himself, it was as if he was looking for trouble. Still, Michael stood tall, his expression calm and unbothered. Richard's smirk widened as he took another step forward. He pulled his dog's leash tighter, making the animal bark sharply. The sudden noise startled a few tourists, who quickly moved away. Michael, however, remained steady, his gaze fixed straight ahead. He knew better than to be provoked. "You think you're better than us," Richard said, his voice dripping with disdain. A few people turned to look, sensing the tension. Some even took out their phones to record what was happening, sensing that this might not end well. Michael, however, didn't move a muscle. The atmosphere grew heavier. The tourists who had been laughing moments ago were now watching in silence, their excitement replaced with unease. The dog's barking echoed through the square, and Richard's smirk turned into a cold, challenging glare. Despite the growing tension, Michael remained as still as a statue. He knew his role, and he wouldn't let anyone, no matter how disrespectful, make him falter. Little did anyone know, this calm before the storm was about to explode into something no one would ever forget. The air grew heavier as Richard's smirk turned into a sneer. His dog, a large and muscular animal, barked louder, causing a ripple of unease among the nearby tourists. Families shuffled back, pulling their children closer. Some exchanged worried glances, while others began recording the scene on their phones, sensing that something was about to happen. Richard, enjoying the attention, took a step closer to Michael. His words were sharp, dripping with mockery. "What's the matter? Too good to say anything. Just standing there like a statue." He chuckled to himself, tugging the leash as his dog growled menacingly. The animal's powerful frame tensed, its sharp teeth bared. Michael, however, didn't react. His face remained calm and composed, his eyes fixed forward as though Richard didn't exist. Inside, though, Michael's training kicked in. He knew this was no ordinary heckler. This man wasn't just trying to annoy him. He wanted a reaction. But Michael wouldn't give him the satisfaction. His silence wasn't just discipline. It was a quiet form of strength. The crowd began to murmur nervously. A few brave tourists tried to reason with Richard. "Hey, "Leave him alone," a man called out from a safe distance. "He's just doing his job." Richard ignored them, his attention fixed on Michael. "Oh, look at this. Silent and proud. Huh." He taunted, his voice louder now, making sure everyone could hear. "You think you're better than us." The dog barked again, louder this time, making some of the crowd flinch. A young boy started crying, clinging to his mother's leg as she hurriedly led him away. Despite the growing tension, Michael stood as still as ever. He could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him, but he refused to let the situation escalate. He had been trained to handle aggression, and today that training was being tested. Richard's patience began to wear thin. He wasn't getting the reaction he wanted. His taunts were met with silence, his attempts to provoke ignored. This only fueled his anger. "Say something, you coward," he shouted, his voice echoing through the square. The dog barked again, straining against the leash. Michael didn't move. He didn't blink. He knew that any reaction, no matter how small, would give Richard the power he wanted. The crowd watched in awe, amazed by Michael's composure. But the tension was unbearable. People whispered among themselves, unsure of how this would end. Suddenly, Richard did something no one expected. He leaned down and unleashed his dog. "Go get him," he yelled, pointing at Michael. The crowd gasped in horror as the dog lunged forward, barking ferociously, its sharp teeth aimed directly at the guard. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. The tourists held their breath, their phones capturing the shocking moment. The dog charged at full speed, its growls echoing like thunder. Michael, however, remained unshaken. His years of training had prepared him for moments like this, and he knew exactly what to do. As the dog closed the gap between them, Michael made his move. Calmly and confidently, he dropped to one knee, extending a hand toward the charging animal. The crowd watched in stunned silence, unsure of what would happen next. The dog charged at Michael with full force, its powerful body lunging through the air. Its growls echoed through the square, making the crowd freeze in fear. People gasped, their eyes wide as they braced for what seemed like an inevitable attack. A woman clutched her chest, while others turned their faces away, unable to watch what they thought would be a horrifying moment. But Michael didn't flinch. As the dog closed the distance, Michael dropped to one knee with calculated precision. His movements were calm, deliberate, and completely unexpected. He stretched out his hand, palm open, facing the animal. His steady voice broke the tension as he spoke softly, "Easy, boy. Easy." The crowd held its breath, their fear turning into disbelief. The dog, mid-lunge, hesitated. Its growl softened into a confused whine as it slowed its charge. It came to an abrupt stop mere inches from Michael, its sharp teeth just a hair's breadth away from his hand. Michael didn't pull back. Instead, he looked directly into the animal's eyes, his expression calm and steady. The once aggressive dog now seemed unsure. It tilted its head, its growls fading into soft, puzzled whimpers. Michael continued to speak in a soothing tone, his voice carrying no trace of fear. "You don't want to do this," he said gently. "You're just doing what you've been told." The square was silent. The tourists stood frozen, their phones still recording but their hearts racing. No one could believe what they were witnessing. Richard, who had been grinning moments ago, now stood with his mouth slightly open, stunned. His confidence was shaken as he watched his dog, his weapon of intimidation, sit down in front of Michael. The large animal, which moments ago had been a symbol of fear, now appeared calm and submissive. Michael slowly moved his hand closer to the dog, letting it sniff him. The dog wagged its tail slightly, its earlier aggression completely gone. It leaned into Michael's hand as he gave it a gentle pat on the head. The crowd erupted into whispers. "Did you see that?" Someone murmured. "How did he do that?" Another asked, their voice filled with awe. A child, who had been clinging to his mother moments earlier, now peeked out, his fear replaced with curiosity. Michael didn't acknowledge the crowd. His focus remained on the dog, making sure it was completely calm. The animal looked up at him, its tail wagging a little faster now, as if it had forgotten why it had charged in the first place. Michael gave the dog another pat before standing up slowly, his movements measured to avoid startling the animal. Richard, meanwhile, was furious. "What are you doing?" He yelled at the dog. "Get him." I said, "Get him." He stomped his foot, but the dog didn't move. It stayed by Michael's side, its body language showing trust in the man who had shown it kindness. The crowd began to turn their attention to Richard. Murmurs of disapproval rippled through the group. Michael, however, still didn't say a word to Richard. Instead, he stood tall, his posture as calm and composed as ever, as though nothing extraordinary had just happened. What the crowd had witnessed was more than just a moment of bravery. It was a lesson in control, compassion, and strength. But the situation was far from over, and all eyes turned to Richard, who was quickly losing control of the moment he had tried so hard to dominate. The tension in the air shifted as the crowd began to stir. What had just happened left everyone in awe. Whispers of disbelief rippled through the square as people tried to process what they had just seen. A royal guard, standing still, silent, and calm, had managed to stop an aggressive dog with nothing but his voice and steady demeanor. It was as if he had performed a miracle. Michael stood tall once more, the dog now calm and sitting at his side. He gently gestured to the animal, and it stayed perfectly still, as if waiting for his command. The tourists who had been recording the incident started to lower their phones, their expressions turning from fear to admiration. Some clapped quietly, others just stared, amazed. Richard, on the other hand, was fuming. His face turned red with frustration as he realized he had lost control of both the dog and the situation. He tugged hard on the leash, trying to get the dog to return to him, but the animal refused to move. It stayed by Michael's side, its tail wagging slightly, as if it had found a new sense of safety. "Get over here," Richard shouted, his voice sharp and angry. He tugged the leash again, but the dog whimpered and leaned closer to Michael, who gave it a reassuring pat on the head. The crowd, which had initially been too scared to intervene, began to speak up. A middle-aged woman, who had been recording the entire scene, stepped forward. "That's enough," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the noise. "You're scaring everyone, and your dog doesn't even want to listen to you." Others joined in, nodding and murmuring in agreement. A younger man called out, "You should be ashamed of yourself. Look at him. He handled your dog better than you ever could." Richard turned to the crowd, his frustration boiling over. "Mind your own business," he barked. "This has nothing to do with you." But the crowd wasn't backing down. More people stepped forward, voicing their disapproval. "Leave him alone," a tourist shouted. "He's just doing his job." Another added, "You're the one causing trouble here." Michael remained silent through it all. He didn't need to say anything. His actions had spoken louder than words ever could. The tourists' support only grew stronger as they realized how composed and professional he had been throughout the ordeal. Richard, feeling cornered, tried to regain control. "This is ridiculous," he spat. "It's just a dog. You're all overreacting." But his words fell flat. The crowd's disapproval was clear, and it was obvious he wasn't going to win this argument. The police arrived moments later, alerted by onlookers who had called them during the commotion. Two officers approached Richard, their expressions stern. "We've received reports of aggressive behavior," one of them said. "We're going to need you to explain yourself." Richard tried to protest, but the crowd was quick to back up the story. He set his dog on the guard. One person said, "We all saw it." Others nodded in agreement, showing the officers their videos as proof. The officers turned to Michael, who simply nodded in acknowledgement, his posture still straight and professional. He didn't speak, but his calm demeanor was enough to confirm what had happened. As Richard was questioned by the officers, the crowd began to applaud Michael. Some approached him cautiously, thanking him for his bravery and composure. One young boy, who had been hiding behind his mother, now looked up at Michael with wide eyes and whispered, "You're a hero." Michael didn't reply. He simply gave the boy a slight nod, his face still calm, but there was a glimmer of kindness in his eyes. The scene wasn't over yet, but Michael had already earned the respect of everyone watching. As the police officers questioned Richard, the atmosphere in the square started to shift. The fear and tension that had gripped the crowd earlier were now replaced with a quiet sense of relief and a growing sense of justice. The dog remained at Michael's side, calm and obedient, as if it had completely forgotten its former owner. Richard's frustration grew with every passing second. He pointed an accusing finger at Michael. "He provoked me," he exclaimed, his voice rising. "I was just minding my own business, and he started it." The crowd erupted in protest. "That's a lie," shouted the woman who had been recording everything. "You're the one who let your dog loose. He didn't even move or say a word to you." More voices joined in. "We all saw what happened," a man called out. "You tried to scare him, but he stayed calm. You're the one causing trouble." The officers exchanged glances, their expressions growing more serious. One of them, a tall man with a calm but firm voice, turned to Richard. "We have multiple witnesses and video evidence that contradict your story," he said. "You'll need to come with us for further questioning." Richard's face turned pale. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, but his voice lacked the confidence it had earlier. "You're taking his side just because everyone's ganging up on me." The officer remained professional. "Sir, this is about your behavior. You endangered the public by unleashing your dog, and that's a serious matter. Please cooperate." As Richard continued to argue, Michael finally spoke for the first time. His voice was calm but firm, carrying the weight of quiet authority. "The dog didn't want to attack," he said, looking directly at Richard. "It only acted because you told it to. Animals aren't born aggressive. They're taught to be. And today this dog chose kindness over fear." The crowd fell silent, hanging on Michael's every word. Even the officers paused, impressed by the simplicity and wisdom in his statement. The dog wagged its tail slightly, as if agreeing with him. Richard opened his mouth to respond but found no words. His confidence was gone, replaced by a growing sense of shame. He looked around at the crowd, at the police, and finally at Michael, who stood tall and unwavering. The officers gently but firmly escorted Richard away, leaving the crowd to focus their attention on Michael. The tourists, who had been recording everything, now stepped forward to thank him. "You're incredible," one woman said. "The way you handled that dog, it was amazing." A young man added, "You didn't even flinch. I don't know how you stayed so calm." Michael gave them a small nod but didn't say much. He wasn't one to seek attention or praise. For him, it was just another day of doing his job and staying true to his values. As the crowd continued to talk among themselves, a little girl stepped forward, holding her mother's hand. She looked up at Michael with wide, curious eyes. "You're like a real-life superhero," she said shyly. For the first time, Michael allowed a small smile to break through his stoic expression. He knelt down, looking the girl in the eye. "Sometimes being brave just means staying calm," he said gently. The girl smiled back, and her mother nodded in appreciation. The crowd began to disperse, but the memory of what they had witnessed stayed with them. Michael's actions had shown them the power of calmness, courage, and compassion in the face of aggression. As Richard was escorted away by the police, the atmosphere in the square shifted from tension to relief. The tourists who had been spectators to the dramatic scene now turned their full attention to Michael. His calm composure throughout the entire incident had left everyone in awe. Many continued to whisper among themselves, replaying the moment the aggressive dog had been calmed by nothing but Michael's steady hand and gentle words. The officers who had stayed behind approached Michael. The taller officer, whose name tag read Officer Daniels, gave him a nod of respect. "Sir, I have to say that was one of the most controlled and brave responses I've ever seen," he said. "Most people would have panicked." Michael, still standing tall, responded simply, "It's part of the job. Staying calm helps diffuse situations." The officer smiled. "Well, you've set a new standard for staying calm under pressure. If you hadn't handled that dog the way you did, this could have ended very differently." One of the tourists nearby, still holding her phone, spoke up. "We have everything on video," she said, stepping forward. "I'm sending this to the authorities. That man shouldn't get away with what he did." The officer nodded appreciatively. "Thank you, ma'am. We'll take all the evidence we can get." As the officers collected witness statements and videos, the crowd began to approach Michael one by one. Some wanted to shake his hand, others wanted to thank him, and a few simply wanted to express their admiration. "You didn't just protect yourself," one man said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You kept the rest of us safe, too. That dog could have hurt someone." Michael acknowledged the man with a slight nod. He didn't see himself as a hero. To him, it was simply a matter of doing the right thing. Among the crowd was an elderly woman who had been sitting quietly on a bench during the incident. She approached Michael slowly, leaning on her cane. "Young man," she said, her voice warm and gentle, "you showed a kind of strength that not many people have. Strength of heart." Michael, humbled by her words, bent down slightly to meet her gaze. "Thank you, ma'am," he said softly. The dog, still sitting calmly at Michael's side, wagged its tail as the woman reached out to pet it. "And you," she said to the dog, "you've found yourself a good protector." The dog looked up at Michael, as if it understood the old woman's words. It leaned against his leg, its earlier aggression completely gone. It was clear to everyone that the animal had chosen to trust Michael over its previous owner. The officers eventually returned, wrapping up their investigation. "We'll be taking the dog into temporary custody," Officer Daniels said. "It'll be assessed to make sure it's safe to rehome. But honestly, it's already clear this dog is no threat in the right hands." Michael gave the dog one last pat on the head before stepping back. The dog whimpered softly as it was led away, but its tail still wagged, as though it understood that it was finally free from Richard's harsh treatment. As the situation came to a close, the crowd began to disperse, but the memory of what they had witnessed lingered. Michael returned to his post, his expression as calm and focused as ever. Yet there was a new sense of admiration in the eyes of the people who passed by. He had shown them all that true strength wasn't just about physical power. It was about staying calm, compassionate, and brave in the face of adversity. The square gradually emptied as people moved on, but what had happened there that day was far from forgotten. Videos of the incident quickly spread across social media, with captions like "The calmest guard in history" and "How kindness defeated aggression." Within hours, clips of Michael's remarkable actions were being shared across the world. Back at Buckingham Palace, Michael continued his duty as if nothing extraordinary had happened. His disciplined posture and stoic expression remained unchanged, even as passers-by began recognizing him. Tourists who had heard about the incident pointed at him with admiration. Some stopped to take pictures, though they didn't dare disturb him while he was on duty. Meanwhile, the video footage was gaining millions of views. People from different countries commented on Michael's bravery and composure. "This is what true strength looks like," one comment read. Another said, "He didn't just stand his ground, he stood for what's right." In the evening, after his shift ended, Michael returned to the small barracks where he stayed with other guards. To his surprise, his fellow soldiers greeted him with applause. "Our very own celebrity," one of them joked, grinning widely. Michael, always humble, shook his head with a slight smile. "I was just doing my job," he said simply. But his colleagues wouldn't let it go. "Doing your job?" Another guard laughed. "You turned a charging dog into a loyal companion with nothing but a steady hand and a calm voice. That's not in the training manual." Michael chuckled lightly, but he didn't respond. He wasn't the type to seek attention, and all this talk about his actions made him slightly uncomfortable. However, deep down, he appreciated the support and respect from his peers. Later that night, as Michael sat in his room, he received a call from his commanding officer. The officer's tone was formal but warm. "Andrews," he said, "I've received dozens of calls and messages about your actions today. People are calling you a hero." "I just stayed calm, sir," Michael replied modestly. "Well, that calmness has inspired a lot of people," the officer said. "We're proud of you. You represented not only the Royal Guard, but also the values we stand for: dignity, restraint, and courage. Excellent work." After the call ended, Michael leaned back in his chair, thinking about everything that had happened. He didn't see himself as a hero, but he was glad that his actions had brought something positive to the world. He hoped that people who saw the videos would understand that strength didn't come from violence or anger. It came from compassion, patience, and staying true to one's principles. The next morning, Michael returned to duty. The square was even busier than usual, with more tourists flocking to see the now famous guard. A young boy ran up to him, holding a small drawing of Michael standing tall with the calm dog at his side. "You're my hero," the boy said shyly, handing him the picture. Michael didn't break his disciplined stance, but he gave the boy a small nod, his way of saying thank you. As he stood there, motionless and focused, he felt a quiet sense of pride. He hadn't sought fame or recognition, but if his actions could inspire kindness and understanding, then it was all worth it. The square gradually emptied as people moved on, but what had happened there that day was far from forgotten. Videos of the incident quickly spread across social media, with captions like "The calmest guard in history" and "How kindness defeated aggression." Within hours, clips of Michael's remarkable actions were being shared across the world. Back at Buckingham Palace, Michael continued his duty as if nothing extraordinary had happened. His disciplined posture and stoic expression remained unchanged, even as passers-by began recognizing him. Tourists who had heard about the incident pointed at him with admiration. Some stopped to take pictures, though they didn't dare disturb him while he was on duty. Meanwhile, the video footage was gaining millions of views. People from different countries commented on Michael's bravery and composure. "This is what true strength looks like," one comment read. Another said, "He didn't just stand his ground, he stood for what's right." In the evening, after his shift ended, Michael returned to the small barracks where he stayed with other guards. To his surprise, his fellow soldiers greeted him with applause. "Our very own celebrity," one of them joked, grinning widely. Michael, always humble, shook his head with a slight smile. "I was just doing my job," he said simply. But his colleagues wouldn't let it go. "Doing your job?" Another guard laughed. "You turned a charging dog into a loyal companion with nothing but a steady hand and a calm voice. That's not in the training manual." Michael chuckled lightly, but he didn't respond. He wasn't the type to seek attention, and all this talk about his actions made him slightly uncomfortable. However, deep down, he appreciated the support and respect from his peers. Later that night, as Michael sat in his room, he received a call from his commanding officer. The officer's tone was formal but warm. "Andrews," he said, "I've received dozens of calls and messages about your actions today. People are calling you a hero." "I just stayed calm, sir," Michael replied modestly. "Well, that calmness has inspired a lot of people," the officer said. "We're proud of you. You represented not only the Royal Guard, but also the values we stand for: dignity, restraint, and courage. Excellent work." After the call ended, Michael leaned back in his chair, thinking about everything that had happened. He didn't see himself as a hero, but he was glad that his actions had brought something positive to the world. He hoped that people who saw the videos would understand that strength didn't come from violence or anger. It came from compassion, patience, and staying true to one's principles. The next morning, Michael returned to duty. The square was even busier than usual, with more tourists flocking to see the now famous guard. A young boy ran up to him, holding a small drawing of Michael standing tall with the calm dog at his side. "You're my hero," the boy said shyly, handing him the picture. Michael didn't break his disciplined stance, but he gave the boy a small nod, his way of saying thank you. As he stood there, motionless and focused, he felt a quiet sense of pride. He hadn't sought fame or recognition, but if his actions could inspire kindness and understanding, then it was all worth it.